What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over punching our enemies. You can see we've changed our enemy over from a cube, from a chamfer I believe it was, to a mutant guy. And if I punch him, he takes damage, he goes into his damage animation, and when I kill him, he dies, his health bar disappears, and he stays in his dead animation. The other thing we're not going to be covering regarding this is he will still have his hitbox today, and he'll still be actually in the scene. We will never clean him up or delete him. I'm going to go over that in a spawning despawning episode, so you'll see his collider still here, but we'll figure that out in another episode because there's a few different ways we could do it depending on how we want his functionality to be afterward. Okay, so what we want to do today is we want to change a little bit about how our collider works to work with this new skeletal mesh, set up his AnimBP, and set up some logic to perform these animations on damage and death. To start out, let's go ahead and make our enemy have his AnimBP and his animations, and then tie the enemy character BP to his AnimBP. So I'll just show you the animations I have before we get started. I have something called Pumpkin Hulk, directly from Mixamo. You can see these are all the default files. So L Shaw, thank you L Shaw. If you're not familiar with how to import animations or models from Mixamo, then feel free to check out this iCard on the top right corner where I've made a video regarding importing any sort of animations or models from Mixamo and putting it in your Unreal project. If you're familiar with that, then I just want to show you here are the animations I have. So there was this model, then I have a death animation, idle, hit, and I called this mid-hit reaction just in case we've got more, and walking, which we're not going to do anything with walking today, but it's good to have. And again, here's the model. I just realized that this screen is full screen, so I can't actually resize it because of where it's at. You see that? I apologize that it's so big, but you can still see everything. So cool. So we have our character, we have our model, and our animations. Now what we want to do is make an AnimBP out of that because we already have a enemy BP called. I just called my default enemy BP. And before he was just a static mesh that had a cube. So, default enemy BP now has been changed over to a skeletal mesh, which is just a mesh once we actually convert it to a character. So I'll show you how to do it in a second. And I've also added a collider. That way we can check for collision without doing any actual checks against the mesh. It's generally bad practice just because it's kind of a bit slower and it can have some weird effects if you want to enable physics on it. But it's not a huge deal one way or another. Okay, so good to go there. There's our enemy. I'll show you how to transfer all that stuff over. But first, let's make a new AnimBP. Go to Add New, Animation, Animation Blueprint. Then you're going to want to pick the skeleton. So I always just use the default, which is Anim Instance. And then I want to pick my Shaw skeleton, my Pumpkin Hulk skeleton. Hit OK. Once I do this, it'll make a new AnimBP for me. Call it whatever you want. I'm calling mine Pumpkin Hulk AnimBP. So he's going to have a few things to start off when you make your new AnimBP. You're going to have this output pose in your anim graph. And you're not going to have anything connected to it. What you need to do here is, this is what will open by default if you're in your animation blueprint for the first time. You can also go to your animation graphs and click anim graph if you need to get back here. Right click and hit add new state machine. Click this, name the state machine whatever you want. I called mine default state machine. Then double click on that state machine. And then this will be the states that he can go to for his different animations. Entries where he starts. So entry to idle is what he'll be playing as soon as this guy spawns in. If he doesn't have a specific entrance animation, then just lead him straight to idle. Idle will be fine. And then we're going to set up all these other rules. Now these other rules will require a few other variables and a few things done in the event graph. So before we get too far ahead, let's go over the states that he's going to go to. Then we'll go over the code in terms of allowing everyone to be able to see these variables in Blueprint, which we've already made most of them visible in Blueprint, but I'll go over that again. And then we'll go over how we set up the character reference so we can actually grab this specific instances variables and then use them to transfer between animations. So to start off, we have 4 states, which if you want to add a new state, you just right click and hit add state. It's that simple. It'll make you rename it something, so just rename them to whatever you want. I have idle, walking, middle hit reaction, and die. So again, walking we won't be using today. That's for an AI episode. So don't worry about that. But just so you know, idle can go to walking, walking can go to idle. So you drag off of one state of the little border here, not the middle, but the little border here, and drag into another state at the border. And then that's how you create a transition. You see it says create a transition right below walking. That's how you know you've done it right. Do that for all your states, for all the ones that are applicable. So for example, I don't have die going back to idle yet because I'm not sure if we want to respawn him or if we want to clean up his asset and spawn a new one in his place or something like that. There's a bunch of different ways we can do it. I might go over a few of the methods, but for now, I'm not having die be able to go back to idle. So once he gets to die, he's dead, just flat out. He won't come back. Okay. Then I have idle to middle hit reaction. Don't worry that it's red. This is a shared transition. I'll talk about that in a second. Middle hit reaction back to idle, and then idle to die, and then walking to middle hit reaction. Okay. So, idle. Let me show you the animations. So idle, you already know this one. But when you get into your graph and you go into your individual states, you just double click on the middle part here where it has the name, and then you can drag in your animations from this side of the asset browser. Because it happened last time, just in case you guys need to find the asset browser because it's not there by default for whatever reason, go to Window and hit Asset Browser. And then just drag in all your states. So idle, middle hit reaction, of course, has middle hit reaction. Make sure you check if they're looping or not, because, for example, if I want idle to loop, but if he gets hit, I don't want him to keep looping the hit animation. I want it to go once. So turn off looping for hit, turn off looping for die. And I don't even know if I put it in because I'm not going to be using it. I did. And keep looping for walking. Cool. So there we go. And now you have your states set up and you have your transitions ready. But the transitions are going to require variables that we've set up in code that aren't quite available to us yet. We need to make a reference in our AnimBP before we can use these. And also, I want to perform a little additional functionality to see if the player has taken damage or is dead, because we did not have those variables prior. So let's go into our code real quick. And we had our Gears of War template character, remember? Well, we're switching over to our default enemy. Last time, again, was just the cube. We're going to add a few more variables this time. We're also going to change his entire class. Let me pull up default enemy BP. If you can see, his parent class is default enemy. So we were using an actor last time for the cube. That's fine. But now that we want him to have some sort of AI related to him, not in this episode, but we're going that direction, and because we want to have things like this regular mesh as opposed to a static mesh, you can see it's a skeletal mesh component, which again, just gets written as mesh when you're using it as a character. So don't get confused. If I were to add a component and go skeletal mesh, this is the same thing. At least to my knowledge, they might be slightly different. But you can definitely use the skeletal mesh that you add component from, and it'll also work. But the reason that I was pointing this out is don't get confused. This just says mesh. It is a skeletal mesh. But by default, when you're using a character as the class in Unreal, you get these components there. Capsule component, arrow component, and the mesh, and the character movement. All these ones that say inherited. So, I wanted to point that out to you. Now, the reason we're switching from actor to character, again, is so we can get these components, and so we can treat it more as, we know this is going to be an enemy character. This is not going to be just an actor. So we might as well let Unreal do as much for us as it can, because Unreal will do a lot for you if you know what to do. Go back into the code, and there's a few things we have to change. First of all, in your includes, it would have been including gameframework/actor.h because it was trying to include the actor file. We no longer need the actor file. We want to include the character file. So go ahead and switch that from actor to character right here. And the other change is in the class that's being inherited, or the class that's this is making a child class and saying, yeah, inherit off of this class. So the parent class now has to be ACharacter as opposed to AActor. Those are the two changes you make. And once you build, if you go ahead and build solution, wait for it to complete, and then compile in here, you won't see any difference in terms of the class settings because it's still going off the default enemy code class, but now you'll have different components. And you can now see that you have your mesh, which for your skeletal mesh, go ahead and put in your pumpkin Hulk. While you're at it, assuming you've already made your animation blueprint, go ahead and animation mode, make sure it's on, use animation blueprint, and then select your anim class, whatever you called it. I called mine pumpkin Hulk AnimBP, and then _C just stands for class. So there you go. Now, once you have your mesh and your AnimBP in there, you'll see he'll start moving on whatever his entry state has brought him to. So that's cool. And that's all you need to do there in terms of changing things. So we'll go back into the code. So now that our class has been changed, you'll notice that none of the functions that we had before are altered in any way. Characters have everything that we were using for the actor anyway, so it doesn't actually hurt us. But we do need to add a few more functions. So we already had a take damage function, and we had a health, but we never had a way to know if they were taking damage. And we never had a boolean to know if they were dead or not. Well, we're going to use these to go to traverse states in the state machine. So go ahead and add two booleans. Make sure they're U properties so we can see them in Blueprint and edit them. So edit anywhere, Blueprint, read write, category enemy, or whatever you want. Bool has taken damage. Bool is dead. Okay. Now, for those guys, make sure you set them to false in the constructor, just because it's good practice. Because the enemy is not taking damage when he's starting out. He shouldn't be in his hit reaction state. And the enemy's also not dead when he's starting out, so he should not be in his die state. Okay, everything else is the same. In take damage, we want to adjust the logic a bit just to set our states. We already had the health minus equals damage, so don't worry about copying that over. Okay, but the health, here's what we're going to do here. So what I should say here before we get into this change is, if you haven't already seen the first episode of this series, you might want to go over now, because now we're going into some stuff that we've already set in the code, which is harder to follow than things that we've already set in Blueprint, because of course you can just look at the settings and copy it. So if you want to look at the first episode, I will leave a link to the video in this iCard right here. If you're good or you already watched it, then great, good to go, but I figured I would let you know while we're here. So what we need to do is determine if the enemy is dead or if they've taken damage. Now, you can take damage and then go to die, but if you want the animation to be a little bit smoother, he should go to take damage every time he's still alive, but when he dies from the damage that was applied to him, he should just die right away. Otherwise, he will go into a take damage animation just to die. And if they don't blend properly or something like that, it won't look so great. Like, think about if you're playing Halo and you're shooting the grunt. If you get a headshot on him and he goes into the take damage animation and then dies, it would not look as nice as just when you shoot him, he just goes into his dead animation. So, just a little thing here. I just basically check if the health is less than or equal to 0, just set him to dead. Else, then just make sure he's taking damage. Okay, again, make sure you build your solution so you can get your changes to Unreal. Make sure you compile, that way Unreal can actually do what it needs to with its changes. Then, now that we have that, we can go into our state machine and finish this section up. So, great, we have our booleans now, but you'll realize if you try and access them, you still won't be able to. Like if I came into this state, idle to middle hit reaction, and I'm looking for the has taken damage function. Well, I can't pull it up. You'll see I have this character reference in here. So the character reference is a reference to the default enemy blueprint object. Okay, So why do we need that? Well, the AnimBP isn't a child of our code class, but the enemy, the default enemy BP, is a child of our code class. The AnimBP is just being used by this class, so we still need a reference to our actual default enemy BP. So we need to make a character reference, because that doesn't come by default. Easiest way for me, and what I pretty much always do, is if you go into the event graph, if you need to find it, it's right here. Just double click this, it'll open up for you. You'll have some nodes by default when you come into your AnimBP event graph. You don't have to use any of them right now other than the event blueprint update animation. This is kind of like a tick function, but these are needed for animations because it needs to play the different frames of the animations and what state they're in and things like that. So for me, and this isn't the best place to do it because you don't want to cast on update, but until we get a better flow where we know where our character is going to be spawned and things like that, this is perfectly fine. We'll move it later, like with the fighting game if you're familiar with that series, so no stress. We'll move it later. For now, this is the easiest way and the best way for the system that we have. Okay, so this try get pawn owner should also be invisible, but if for whatever reason you don't have either of these nodes, you can just type them in. Just type in event blueprint update animation. That's one. And then type try get pawn owner. That's two. You have these two nodes. Now, once you have them, all we need to do is see if the pawn owner is a default enemy BP. Just for whatever reason, in case you're using this AnimBP for multiple, you might want to check. You might need to do multiple casts. Like if there's different enemies with palette swaps, but they actually have different abilities or something, whatever. But make sure you're casting from the pawn owner to your default enemy BP. So whatever your enemy blueprint class is. Literally, you just type in cast to default enemy BP. Simple. Then you drag off this, and you can hit promote to variable, which will make a new variable here for you. This is your character reference. I've already got one named character reference, but that's how you can make a one really quickly. You can always go to your variable, type in the object you're trying to create a reference for, which in our case, again, default enemy BP, object reference. There you go. And call it character reference and then set it. Only set it if it's valid. If it's not valid, it could crash. If it's not valid anyway, you won't be able to do a lot of this stuff because, again, the reference isn't valid, so it doesn't know how to go to any of those states, so there's a bigger problem at play. But just to be on the safe side, of course, only do it if it's valid. Now, these other things you won't be able to find just yet. We have to set them up in the state machine, so don't worry about that. But now that we have our character reference, we can reference that in the states. So you can see I can just drag onto the screen, character reference. Or I could just type in get character reference. Either way, whatever is easier. And then you can drag off of this and find your variable. So for idle to middle hit reaction, we want to find has taken damage. If I could spell it right. Because we want to know if we were trying to go to the middle hit reaction, that's when the enemy was hit. Well, we only want to do that if the enemy has taken damage. So that's the boolean we have set up for that right now. Drag that into your result that is always here in your states. And you'll be good to go. If the has taken damage boolean is true for that character reference, idle, the character will go from idle to middle hit reaction state. Technically, he will also go from walking to middle hit reaction because these are shared transitions. So, shared transitions, the reason these guys are red, these are transitions that have the exact same rule. So you can have transitions that have the same rule that aren't shared, but if you update one, it won't update the other. If they are shared, if you update one, it will update the other. So just in case we want to, if we punch the player, if we punch the enemy and we want him to stop walking and go into the middle hit reaction state, well then this is how you would do it. You can click on your little transition node from idle to middle hit reaction, where we were just at. Go over to the details panel, go over to transition rule sharing, and if you click on one that's not shared, you'll see it says promote to shared. So once you hit promote to shared, I'll ask you to give it a name. I named it middle hit reaction. And then it'll tell you what the rule is. And then when you click on another state you want to apply that transition to, like this one, or like an empty one, hit use shared and then just click on the shared transition you want to use. So now idle and walking to middle hit reaction are the same transition rule. Okay, now, again, we're leaving idle to walking and walking to idle alone for now, so this is good. The only things we have to cover are middle hit reaction back to idle and idle to die. So middle hit reaction back to idle is a little bit different. We're not going to check and see if he's like not taking damage anymore or something like that. Basically, once middle hit reaction animation is finished, he should return to idle. So you can see we have intentionally not set the animation to loop. So when the animation is done, we can send it back to idle by doing something right here. If you click on the transition rule, like middle hit reaction back to idle, and look in your details under transition, automatic rule based on sequence player in state. This means that, it means a lot of things, but basically the most important one, at least for today's episode, is that if the animation, or if the state doesn't have a better state to go to because there's no other rules that are saying, hey, go over to die, or go over to walking, or whatever, then once this animation is done, it'll automatically take this transition. So we'll automatically go from middle hit reaction back to idle. So that's what you want. But there is something else we're going to do here. When we're returning from our hit reaction to our idle, we want to have a notification here. If you see details panel, scroll all the way down to notifications, start transition event, custom blueprint event, return to idle. What this means is when this animation starts, when we're about ready to enter the idle transition, or the idle state from the middle hit reaction state, then we want to call this blueprint event return to idle. So whatever you type in here will become a blueprint event you can access in the event graph. So now that I've typed in return to idle, I'll be able to find return to idle. So just do return to idle, and you can see the notify event and the call function. You want the notify event, and this is what this is the action we're gonna perform when this is called. So this will be called when the take damage is done, and we want to grab our character reference, and we want to set has taken damage back to false, just like that, and set it back to false. Because what we're doing is, okay, so the taken damage state is over. The animation is done, which means this enemy is no longer taking damage. If we didn't do this, if we didn't set this back to false, then he would just continuously go into this state. He'd go middle hit reaction, back to idle. Oh wait, the boolean is still true for has taken damage. We're going to go back here, go back to idle, it's still true, and it would be in an endless loop. However, by setting it to false when the animation is done, then we end that endless loop. There's one other thing we want to do. We want to go from idle to die. So idle to die doesn't have any states, don't worry, but what we want is this. So we go from idle to die if they're dead. That simple. The other boolean we sent in the code. Not complicated, right? Great. Working fine. But what we need to do is add another custom blueprint event on the start transition. Because if we're going from idle to dead, or idle to die, which I should probably change this to dead because I want to say dead. So let's say dead. Okay. If we're going from idle to dead, we want to clean up some things, and we'll probably clean up the capsule collider and all here too. Again, I just didn't want to cover that because we'll be covering a lot of the concepts in that episode, in a different episode. So we'll be covering that stuff later. So I didn't do anything with it for now, but when he's dead, we want to remove, so if I click on this transition, we want to remove the health bar that's floating there. And again, we might want to despawn him or also remove his capsule collider, or at least make it so that it's not colliding with us anymore. So if you make a new transition event in here, custom blueprint event died, that's simple. So you can see in this anim notify, and if I click and go event anim notify died, this is the one we want, leads us right here. What we're going to do is set our health bar to be invisible. So we grab our character reference. Remember, this is a default AnimBP, so anything this default AnimBP has, we can access. So we're going to grab our health bar. Now, health bar is our widget that we made, our 3D health bar out here. You can see health bar is already highlighted, this widget component. So that's what we're grabbing. Again, you could also grab your capsule collider and disable collision and things like that. We're just not going to be doing that in this episode. But we're going to drag off our health bar and type set visibility right here. And then make sure new visibility is unchecked, which means visibility is false, which means it will no longer render once the enemy has gone into the died or dead state. So there you go. Okay, cool. So that's all well and good. Now our animation blueprint is done, our code is done, but there is one more thing we need to do. We need to make sure that our fist can actually hit this enemy. So now that we're not using a static mesh, and also we're not using physics the same way, so we can still use physics simulations like we were last time to punch around that cube, or even to punch around this guy, but he will go flying, and he won't be a very good enemy. It'll look kind of funny, actually. So we're going to need to change up the way that the collision works a bit. That's the reason I've added a capsule collider. So don't worry, I didn't forget to talk about it or anything. It doesn't come default, just it wasn't important to this point. Now that we have everything set up, we need to make sure we have some way to collide. So let me give you a quick reasoning for what I'm doing. So the mesh that's inherited that we applied the AnimBP and the skeletal mesh to. Now, he doesn't have physics simulated by default. In fact, you can tell I haven't touched any of this, because if you edit something in here, like you'll see that there'll be an undo, reset to default, if it's not the default. So he doesn't have physics simulated by default, which is fine. No problem there. And his collision presets are character mesh. Now that's why this is kind of weird. We don't want to be doing collision checks against the character mesh per se. It's not the end of the world, but it can get weird. It can make him do weird things, like part of his body will just like fly over to the side here when he gets hit, and you know, it can look funny, but unless you're doing like a ragdoll game, it's not really the effect you're going for. So what I opted to do instead was to just make a separate collider, which is pretty common, right? To have a collider that actually deals with your health and your collision, as opposed to using your mesh for it. So your mesh still has collision, so he's not going to go walking through the wall or something. He still has character mesh collision. This is good. But for specific collision about where we're hitting him, like with our fist and stuff, we can go ahead and just add a collider to just see if there's a collision occurring. It's also usually less expensive as well, so you can have more collisions occurring before you get into lag or poor performance or anything like that. So go ahead and add component and type capsule capsule collision. I called mine capsule collider. Now I made it a little bit smaller than the player. You can make it just as big as if you want, but depending on how your mesh is, like for this guy, if I made it just as big, it was colliding before I would actually get to him. And I mean, I don't want the player to feel stopped from walking directly up to the enemy. They should be able to walk up as closely as they can until they're touching them. So I didn't want to make it too big, so I made it a little bit smaller. So the collider is only blocking the player once he gets basically where he's touching the enemy. That way it just looks a little bit better. So make it the size that feels right. It doesn't too much matter as long as it's still easy enough to hit. You don't want to make it like really hard to hit because it's super tiny. So there you go. The health bar is always jittering around, so don't worry about that. But okay, once you put in the collider, and you can move it around just like this, I'm going to undo it. But you can move it around as much as you want. And scale it up or down. You can change the height or the radius. You have all the freedom here, so you can change it as much as you want to get the shape you want. There's a few things we have to do. So we're going to simulate physics on it. This is what we're going to simulate physics on. There's other ways to do collision, but I like simulating physics when you're using components like how we attached our collision to our hand. I like simulating physics because Unreal does a very good job of keeping track of all that stuff. So again, you might not want to do that for your mesh, but for a capsule collider, it's great. Simulate physics. I turned gravity off. I don't think this really matters, but it's following the player anyway. So I just wanted to follow what the player's doing and not do anything, or the enemy is doing and not do anything separate, just in case he's got to jump down from somewhere. The capsule collider will come with him, don't worry. So I just turned it off for safety reasons. And also I feel like it's probably quicker. I don't actually know, but I assume not doing this calculation is better, better for performance. But either way, just kind of a sanity thing for me. I went ahead and locked all these positions so that the capsule collider is not moving around. Because if you simulate physics and you punch it, it's going to go flying. We want to lock its position where it's at. We don't want it to go flying all over the place. We want it to be right here so that we can continuously hit this guy. Otherwise, his capsule collider is going to be 300 feet away from him and not helpful to us. I also went ahead and unchecked these, apply impulse on damage, and replicate physics to autonomous proxy. I mean, again, just a safety thing. I don't think it's necessary to uncheck them, but we don't need to do them, so why do them? I also went ahead and still generated hit events. Hit events, you know, not necessarily required, but since we're doing an on-component hit in the logic here, then, well, yeah, we need hit events. If we were doing another collision like overlap or something, you wouldn't need this. You'd need to generate overlap events, which really this could be turned off. But, yeah, good to go. And then make sure the collision presets, this is set to pawn. Because pawn collision will work perfectly fine for what we need. So there, your collision presets are set up for this guy. One more thing, it's important to note that the right-hand collision, here are the collision presets. I don't think I've changed anything since last time, but just so you guys are aware, the right-hand collision, which is the one that is attached to the fist here, and if you need to know how to do that, I set that up in the previous episode, so I'll leave an iCard right here for you. I don't think I've changed anything, but just know Simulate Physics is off for this guy. This stuff is all still checked, just because I didn't edit it. Simulate Generate Hit Events is on for this guy, and Generate Overlap Events can actually be off again. Can character step on? I said no, it's not really a big deal, to be honest, if you change this or not, and make sure it's a pawn again. Now, there's one other thing that I want to go over today. It's very quick, but I just want to show you. So we punch our guy, right? Great. Now, if we were to punch him, he would actually lose like all of his health right away, just because of the way we have it set up. So I added a quick little boolean here, which you can feel free to use. It's not super important, and it doesn't even fully fix the issue, but it makes it a lot cleaner for now until we get into a better system. So again, we already set this up last time, but I'm going to add this has punched boolean to it to kind of show you guys what I'm talking about. So I went into my character, my Gears of War template character.h, which is just my assassin character I have there. I know it's confusing, but he's just my main character. So whatever your default character is. And I went ahead and added a boolean called has punched. You can see the comment there. Basically, what this has punched is doing is it's checking if we press the has punched button or if he's just still continuously colliding with the fist. Because if the enemy's still colliding with the fist, we don't want to damage him multiple times. It's every time we punch. However, we don't have any sort of limiter on how many times the enemy or the player can press the punch button, and that boolean will go to true. So, has punched, remember, I set it up in the header file. Then, in the constructor, make sure you set has punched to be false, because we haven't punched when we're just starting. Then, scroll down to where you're performing the punch, such as in, if I could find it, punch. This is the function that's being called when we press the button that's bound to the punch key. Set has punched to be true, because at this point we have punched. Simple enough. Okay, so now that we've done that, and that already was the case, right? But now we can disable it and set it to be false after the enemy has taken damage. So it's useful to be able to check if the enemy has hit the has punched key more than once. So in our right hand collision on component hit check, we cast and make sure the other actor is the default AnimBP, which we were already doing. But now we check and see if has punched, just literally type it in. Don't have to use a character reference or anything since we're in the character BP right now. We get has punched, and then if it's true, then they take damage. Then we set has punched back to false. Now, that works. That makes it so they don't automatically take like all their health in one hit. The problem is I can continuously hit the has punched button, and they will still die. So what you'll want to do is actually disable that from being true until after their take damage is gone, or until after the has punched animation is gone. Either way, but for now, it's good enough, just so that he doesn't die instantly and you can actually hit him multiple times. There you go, guys. So that's how you can set up enemy animations and enemy death and even enemy damage, since last time we were kind of just doing the default damage for hitting our little cube guy on an actual AnimBP, actual static mesh of a character enemy. So if this video helped you or you enjoyed, please subscribe. It's the most important thing you can do for the channel, and it just shows me that I'm doing a good job teaching you guys. If you did have any issues with this episode or just have any suggestions or things you want to talk about, feel free to join the Discord. Can't put an iCard because YouTube doesn't like it, but it's in the description. And just look for Discord. And if you click that, you'll join it. We got a community with people willing and happy to help you. So if you had any issues, feel free to join. Lastly, if you want to come support us on Twitch, we play Dark Souls style games on Wednesday and Resident Evil games on Friday. So we've been having a lot of fun going through Resident Evil 4 in professional difficulty, and a ton of fun playing Dark Souls 2 for the first time. Anyway, guys, I'm Shawnthebro. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.